Allora, buonasera. Intanto vi ringrazio per essere qui, questa lezione magistrale. Sono molto contento che Johan Wagemans abbia accettato di presentare questo che è un evento tradizionale per l'IP. Ora, non farò una introduzione diciamo dettagliata di quello che Wagemans ha fatto come ricercatore negli anni, ma mi limiterò semplicemente a dire che sicuramente è uno dei più importanti rappresentanti della psicologia nel campo, non solo della psicologia della percezione, ma direi anche della psicologia cognitiva in generale. E proviene anche da un'università molto importante in Europa, che è l'Università di Lovanio, l'Università Cattolica di Lovanio, e quindi direi semplicemente di gustarci la lezione e darei semplicemente la parola a Johan, e presentando semplicemente il titolo del suo contributo, che sarà Not all Gestalts are equal, the encoding of parts and wholes in the visual cortical hierarchy.
Thank you very much. Is the sound okay like this? Yeah. Yes, okay, thank you. I apologize for doing this in English. I have seen several talks so far with English titles and Italian slides and Italian talks. I've seen talks with English titles and English slides with Italian talks, and I will do English title, English slides, and English talk, if that's all right with you. So. It's my pleasure to be able to give you this keynote lecture, and thank you for the invitation, Luigi, and the other organizing committee. So I will talk about Gestalts. I do have a Gestalt revision research program in Leuven, where we try to reintegrate Gestalt psychology into contemporary vision science and cognitive neuroscience. And I will present some of the ideas and ongoing research projects within the context of that research program. So let me start with some examples. I can draw some shapes on the screen like these, and then I can rearrange them like this, and suddenly you will see a Gestalt emerging. That is, you will see a phase that consists of these shapes that are now the parts of this larger whole, and it's about this type of part-whole relationships that I will be talking. So here's another example. You see a pair of eyes. I put an exact copy of the same pair of eyes next to it, and then I'll add some context, and now you see this person looking over there and this person looking over here. So your perceived direction of gaze of these eyes is affected by the direction of the phase within which these eyes are embedded. So a typical effect of context on the perception of the parts. Here's another example from a recent paper, 3 years ago in Scienze, where they asked people to evaluate whether the face and the person was happy after having won a point or sad after having lost a point. So it's your task to judge whether these faces and bodies are happy or sad. I don't find that an easy task. I don't know about you, but I will give you some cues. So green is happy and sad, and red is sad. I don't know whether the colors are easy to see from where you are given the light conditions, but now you see some of the interpretation of the emotional expression. If you do a study like this, apparently the body is more important than the face to disambiguate whether the person has won or lost a point. You can also create combinations of faces and bodies, and of course you can make some of these combinations congruent, that is both face and body express the same emotion, or incongruent, and again it's your task to try to judge which one is which here. And again I'll put the colors to indicate. So this is Martina Navratilova after having won a point. This is, I don't know the name of the guy anymore, but he lost a point. And here you see the combinations that are incongruent. So a sad face in the context of a happy body, and a happy face in the context of a sad body. And again, in these combinations, it turns out that the body posture is more important than the faces to judge emotional expression, which runs counter your intuitions, perhaps. Here's a last example. You see a scene of people. Each person has a body, and the body has arms and a head, and the head has features like nose, eyes, mouth, etc. So there's a whole nesting of part-whole relationships. In this example, the highest level, the most global level, if you want, is a crowd of people. Then you can individuate people. Within the person, you can separate body from body parts. Then you have the face and face parts, etc. So this is a whole nesting of part-whole relationships, and it's about that type of hierarchy between part and whole that I will be talking. So when I talk about visual hierarchy, it's really this nesting of features and parts in wholes, and these wholes can be objects, faces, bodies, and scenes, and you have multiple levels of part-whole relationships in all of these hierarchies. That's the idea. So that's the notion of visual hierarchy. Then there's also the notion of cortical hierarchy. That is our current view of how the visual cortex processes incoming visual information, and that is supposed to be in a hierarchical fashion as well. So a lot of this mainstream view is based on single unit recordings by Hubel and Wiesel, for which they won the Nobel Prize, as you all know. So they discovered tuning properties of different types of cells in different areas of the brain. So with tuning, for instance, to orientation or to motion direction, etc. So functional specialization is another key component of this cortical hierarchy. So you have some areas that do motion detection, others do line orientation detection, others do color, etc. So there is quite a bit of functional specialization there as well. And the last component of this is the hierarchical organization. So the fact that there are stages of processing, some of the lower level areas doing feature level processing, and then building up the larger parts when you move higher up in the hierarchy. So this mainstream view has been confirmed also in human neuroimaging with the notion of modules and maps. So you have retinotopic maps, for instance, where different cells respond to stimuli from different parts of the visual field. Modules, you know, a typical module is a phase detection module, the fusiform phase area. So you have specialization at that higher level as well. And this standard view, which I call the mainstream view, is really very strongly dominating current visual neuroscience. So I will just give you 3 examples to illustrate this mainstream view. So one is by Velleman and Van Essen with this cortical wiring diagram. So you have all these boxes that indicate different processing stations, if you want, in the hierarchy. And then you have a lot of interconnections between these different areas, obviously, to transmit information from one area to another. Not only feed forward, but also feedback. This is a slide from a review paper by Grill-Spector and Malach, where you also see functional specialization in the cortex. So the early visual areas are here at the back, and then you have V1, V2, V3, V4. That's a typical stream in the cortical hierarchy. You have specialization for central vision versus peripheral vision, and then higher up you have some other types of specialization. You have motion areas, you have color areas, etc. And then this is the third example. This comes from a computational network where they start from the connectivity diagram that I showed earlier, and then they have a neural network representing small receptive fields in the first stages of processing, and then gradually larger and larger. And as you can see here, initially the units in that network respond to small features like an oriented bar, and then higher up you see combinations of features, and you really see parts of the stimulus emerging that sometimes correspond to parts of the image, like for instance the head of a lion. And I have a network to do simulations as well, but I will not go into the details. But this is really typical of the mainstream view on cortical hierarchy. I would like to point out that there are alternative views possible that differ in their view on part-whole relationships, and a typical alternative view I would like to emphasize is the Gestalt theory, and in particular the Berlin school of Gestalt theory, with main figures like Wertheimer, Kafka, and Köhler, as you all know. And let me just rephrase why I think they provide an alternative view. So what are the main ideas of the Berlin school? They have this idea that the wholes are more than the sum of the parts. That means if you start combining the parts, you get emergent properties at the level of the whole that are more than the sum of the parts. Yeah? You get emergent properties, for instance, von Ehrenfels already indicated that a melody is more than just a series of notes. You can transpose them and it's still perceived as the same melody. So this idea of wholes being more than the sum of the parts was already present in the Gestalt school of Graz, but the Berlin school added a second idea, and that is that the wholes are also different from the sum of the parts. So not just that you have combinations of parts and a whole that has emergent properties that are more than the sum of the parts, but also you have wholes within which the parts behave differently. You can describe this as two-sided dependency. So the whole is not only depending on the combination of the parts, but also vice versa. If you have a specific organization at the level of the whole, the parts sometimes get a different role. So you also have this dependency of the parts on the whole as well. And another critical idea of the Berlin school of Gestalt psychology is that the wholes come first, so they have precedence. And that, I think, runs counter to the mainstream view on hierarchy. For instance, the global precedence effect that some of you might know with Navon's hierarchical letters. The idea is that you first, your initial percept is really at the global level of the big letters, like here you see in H, and only after a while you also have access to the local letters as well. But the global level precedes your perception, and you can run conditions to actually prove that in reaction times, for instance. There are other alternative views possible that are more recent, so contemporary views that I believe are also not strictly following the mainstream view, and I will point out two of these more recent alternative views. One is by Hochstein and Ahisar, who have labeled their theory reverse hierarchy theory. And the idea, it's a relatively complex theory, and they have lots of empirical results to support it, but the bottom line is this. You have low-level areas and you have high-level areas, but rather than a slow serial processing that starts from local features and then builds the whole gradually, the idea is that you have a very fast feed-forward sweep, and you generate percepts at this highest level first. So they make a distinction between low level and high level in terms of the anatomical structure, but they disentangle that from early and late. So the early processing can be at a high level in the visual cortical hierarchy. That's the idea. So you have a fast feed-forward sweep generating descriptions at the level of the scene or the level of complete objects, and you only have these recurrent loops where you go back to the initial stages where you have the small receptive fields if the task requires it. So for instance, in a complicated visual search task where you need a resolution at a very small feature level and the fine orientation discrimination, only then you go back to the lowest level. So low level can be late and high level can be early. That is why it's a perturbed, reversed hierarchy. Yeah? A second theory by Moshe Bar also comes up with a version of an alternative view on the cortical hierarchy. Here the idea is that from an input image, you first extract low frequency information, and again that goes pretty fast, and you generate hypotheses about the possible shapes of the objects in the image based on the low frequency information, because that is transmitted faster. Also based on the low frequency information, you can generate hypotheses about the scene context. And then at the same time, you have this slower, incremental, more traditional way of feed-forward processing, where you extract the high spatial frequencies, and then you integrate them with the hypotheses that are generated at this level and also at this level of context. Yeah? So that is the idea of integrating high-level interpretations that are generated quickly with the detailed level information that are processed more slowly. And again, there's quite a bit of behavioral and neural evidence to provide empirical support to this idea. So these more recent views, I think, have interesting characteristics from the viewpoint of Gestalt theory. For instance, that the wholes come first. Also that it's very highly interactive. There's really an interplay between these different levels of processing and these different scales of representation, and it's also highly dynamic. It's not a very static, sequential view. So what is the problem now? This is just background context. The problem is how to understand the relationships between parts and wholes in visual experience. That is how we perceive and experience the visual world. Secondly, how to understand the encoding of parts and wholes in the hierarchy of visual cortex. And then as a third part of the problem, how to understand the relationships between cortical encoding on the one hand and visual experience on the other hand. So that, I think, is now the challenge given this conflicting views, Gestalt view versus mainstream view on cortical hierarchy. So my proposal is, I'll give you the answer to the question already from the beginning, that is that not all Gestalts are equal. It may sound like a simple statement, but I think if you flesh it out, it becomes a really deep statement. So there are different types of Gestalts with their own relationships between parts and wholes, both in visual experience and in their neural encoding. So it's not a simple story of one fits all, but there are different types of Gestalts with different relationships between parts and wholes. And I will distinguish some of these and provide illustrations as well. So some Gestalts seem to be encoded in low-level areas based on feedback from higher-order regions. There's two examples mentioned here on the slide, and I'll just briefly indicate what they are about, but I will not go into the details. The first one is by Zoe Curzi and colleagues, who showed that contour integration, that is the integration of contour elements into a coherent closed shape with overall shape properties, is something that can be done already early in the visual cortex, in the low-level stages. They have some monkey work showing that it can be done in peripheral V1 and in central V2, so really pretty early in the sense of low-level cortical hierarchy. But of course, with fMRI, it's quite well possible that it depends on feedback, and it would be interesting to know where these higher-level percepts are really generated. But you can find evidence already for contour integration in V1 and V2. And the second study that some of you may have seen is from a couple of years ago in Nature Neuroscience, where they demonstrated that individual differences that have to do with the strength of the corridor illusion, which is a size illusion, depends on individual differences in the size and density of the primary visual cortex. So again, at the level of V2. I cannot go into the details, but again, it indicates that these higher level percepts that are clearly affected by context can also be emerging from representations at the level of V1. So that is one type of Gestalt, low-level areas, but probably based on feedback. And then I will make another distinction between different types of higher-order Gestalts. So the Gestalts that are encoded in higher-level areas, with the parts being encoded in lower-level areas, so the more traditional idea, perhaps. But now I will distinguish cases that have no suppression of the parts and cases that have suppression of the parts. And I will label these different types of higher level Gestalts differently. So I make a distinction between preservative and eliminative gestalts. Difficult terms, but I'll explain what they mean. So with preservative gestalts, we mean functional wholes that arise spontaneously and the parts become less functional, but the encoding of these wholes at the higher levels of the cortical hierarchy does not suppress the encoding of the parts. So the parts still exist. They are still preserved in the context of the gestalt. So that is why I call them preservative gestalts. And secondly, the eliminative gestalts, these are gestalts where the wholes dominate and the parts disappear from experience. And the wholes emerge in higher areas of the brain, and the encoding of the parts is then suppressed. So here the parts are suppressed, they are basically eliminated from visual experience. Yeah, so these are two different types of gestalts, and what I'll do in the rest of the talk is I will give examples of behavioral and neural studies that illustrate these different types of higher level gestalts, preservative versus eliminative gestalts. So for preservative gestalts, an excellent example is the configural superiority effect. The people working on perception will probably know this work from Jim Pomerantz. It's really classic work that is also included in introductory psychology textbooks. I'll illustrate what it is, and I will present a study on the neural basis of the configural superiority effect. This study has been published in Scienze in 2011. It's work done by Jonas Kubilius, who was a PhD student at the time, and in collaboration also with Hans Op de Beek, who is a professor whose main specialization is fMRI, and more in particular, the use of multivoxel pattern analysis of neuroimaging results. So this is really a joint effort. So here is the configural superiority effect. Many of you will know. So the task for the subject is really easy. It's to find the odd man out. So it is to find an element that is different from the other elements in the display. So for example, with a display like this, you will have seen that this element has a different orientation from the other three, and it's relatively easy to find. Now, if you add another type of display that has no cue as to where the odd man out is, so it's completely redundant with respect to localizing the odd man out, you get now a new combination. We call this the whole because it basically combines these parts with these parts. And now suddenly you will see that this guy here pops out at you. It's much easier to find than the same diagnostic element over here. So I have basically added nothing, and yet it's much easier to do the task at the level of wholes than at the level of the parts. That's the configural superiority effect. The configuration supports superior performance. So this is behavioral results showing that. These are data from subjects in the scanner. So it's a very robust effect that you can also easily obtain in the scanner. For multiple testing runs, so people have done this for hundreds and hundreds of trials, and you see that percent correct is still much higher for the condition with the wholes than for the condition with the parts. There is some learning taking place here for the parts, but even after a couple of hundred of trials, you still have a robust superiority effect. Same with the reaction times. You see some learning taking place as well, but the whole reaction times are clearly shorter than the reaction times for the parts. So this is really much faster than this. Basically a behavioral replication of your own phenomenological impression. So that was all known already. But what was not known is where in the brain these behavioral results are supported. So for that we had experimental runs just like the ones I've shown before, and we had localizer runs. Basically, a localizer run is a way to try to localize a brain area that is supposed to do certain things. So when you present images of pictures and you have also scrambled images, the subtraction of these two types of images gives you where objects are encoded in the visual brain. And this is basically the lateral occipital complex for those of you who are interested. And then there's also meridian mapping runs that allows you to localize the retinotopic areas, V1, V2, etc. So this is again relatively standard, and you get extractions of these brain areas. So this is the calcarine sulcus at the back of your brain. So we unfold the brain, and then you see the cortical hierarchy here with V1, V2, and V3. You can individuate these areas for individual subjects. And then higher up in the stream, you see this lateral occipital complex that is supposed to encode objects. So this is relatively standard. What is relatively new in this study is the use of multivoxel pattern analysis. Now, I think I cannot assume that everyone knows what that is, and I cannot spend too much time explaining, but let me try. So based on the pattern of activity, not a single voxel, but all the levels of activities in all of the voxels, you basically split your data in half, and you use half of your data to train a classifier. That is a machine learning technique that can distinguish these activities, these patterns of activities. And then after training, you use your second half of the data to see how well your classifier can detect, based on the differences between these patterns, what the brain has been seeing and what the brain has been doing based on that simple learning rule. Yeah? So that is basically how it works. You have half of the data for the learning algorithm, and then you use the rest of the data to test what the learning algorithm has discovered based on the patterns of activities in different areas. And that's the nice thing. You can see how well you can decode what the brain is doing from different parts of the brain. So that is multivoxel pattern analysis, also called decoding. It's like reading what your brain is seeing or doing. Yeah? And this is now proportion correct of the decoding. That is, how well can you decode what was visible to the subject when he or she was doing the experiment based on that machine learning algorithm. And then what you see is that in low-level visual areas, V1 and V2, you can decode parts better than the whole. And in the higher order areas, basically LOC, the lateral occipital complex, you can decode the whole better than the parts. That interaction, I think, is key for the point I want to make about preservative gestalts. So the wholes are coded in the higher level areas, but the parts are coded in the low level areas. So you can still decode the parts in the presence of the wholes. And you can basically see that across the whole visual cortical hierarchy, but I will not go into the details here. So we replicated the behavioral configural superiority effect, and we also found what we could call a neural configural superiority effect, that is better coding of wholes than parts in higher shape selective regions, the lateral occipital complex, and better coding of the parts than the wholes in lower level retinotopic regions, basically V1 and V2. So the general conclusion from this is that at least some gestalts emerge only at higher stages of visual information processing. Apparently these configural superiority effects emerge in LOC, and feed-forward processing may in this case be sufficient to produce some gestalts. I'm not saying that we can exclude top-down effects based on the fMRI results. We cannot, but the story could in principle be based on a feed-forward model. So this is an example of a preservative gestalt because you have coding of the wholes in a higher level area, and at the same time you can still decode the parts from the low level area, so they are still preserved. That's the idea. Now I will move on to two examples of eliminative gestalts. One is motion silencing, and I will illustrate the effect, and the second one is bistable diamond, and again I will illustrate the effect, but here you have some papers if you want to read more details. So first, the motion silencing effect. It's striking phenomenon that has won the Best Illusion of the Year contest in 2011. Yeah, vision scientists are really fond of illusions. They do competitions for that at the Vision Science Society meeting in Florida every year. And in 2011, this one has won the Best Illusion of the Year. So if you have not seen it before, I'll show it to you. Basically, you have to fixate this little dot in the middle here that you probably do not see. You have a disk consisting of colored dots. At one part of the phenomenon, you'll see these colored dots changing color, quite easy to see. And then after a while, this disc starts rotating. And then it becomes harder to see the color changes. That is basically the phenomenon of motion silencing. So watch out, keep fixating in the middle. Easy to see these color changes. Now it starts rotating, and now it's much harder to see. Do you agree? So I'll do it again if you want. Easy to see the color changes of the local elements, that's the idea. When the whole disk starts rotating, the color changes at the local level become much less accessible. That is why it's called motion silencing. In the presence of the motion, you silence the detection of the color differences. Yeah, you can show it with other features as well, like luminance. So it works for luminance changes as well. I don't know how easy that is to see here. For size, and also for shape. So these crosses change into diamonds and circles. They scintillate, quite easy to see, and then when they start moving, it's much harder to see. Of course, it's nice to demonstrate this, and it's nice if you experience this, but experimental psychologists always want to confirm experiences. They don't often trust their own personal experiences. So they do experiments like this, 100 dots, first stationary, then rotating back and forth for 30 degrees, and the two phases alternate every 3 seconds. And the task of the observers is to adjust the rate of change of those color changes or luminance changes during the stationary phase to match the apparent rate of change in the moving phase. So it's an adjustment task. And the rate of change, they call the silencing factor, varies between 0.1 when static is perceived as changing slower, and 10 when static is perceived as changing faster. So remember, you perceived static as changing faster, so you should get numbers higher than 1. And that is also what you find. You see both for U, luminance, size, and shape, that all of these silencing factors are really higher than 1. So the experiment has confirmed our own impressions, which is always good. What's the interpretation of this phenomenon? What does it mean? So the authors of the motion silencing effect, Sushov and Alvarez, came up with this explanation. They say that local mechanisms have small receptive fields, and because a fast-moving object spends only very little time at any one location, a local detector is allowed only a brief window in which to assess the changing object. So you have these small receptive fields. When the object is moving, there's only a short time in which you can judge what the color is in that local window. So they basically have an anatomical interpretation of the motion silencing effect. It might be correct. It might also be something else. We came up with an alternative interpretation in terms of objecthood. We think that if these local dots, these colored dots, start moving together, they form a really good object because of common fate and everything like that. And in the context of that really good high-level object interpretation, so when a good whole is formed, the details of the parts, these local colored elements, don't matter anymore for the visual system. And therefore, they are fundamentally less accessible to conscious perception. So we come up with a Gestalt interpretation rather than this anatomical interpretation in terms of local receptive fields. Now, it's nice to come up with an alternative interpretation, but you need evidence as well. So we came up with a different study to try to make that point. And that study is by Erwin Polyak and Lee DeWitt, 2 postdocs in my group, and the paper was published in Cognition a couple of years ago. So the motivation of that study was to test this alternative interpretation, and we used biological motion rather than the rotating disk. I will justify why we used biological motion. So why biological motion? It's a really good case of a complex hierarchical stimulus, so with nesting of parts in the context of larger wholes. We know that these gestalts are constructed automatically, and the construction of the perceptual whole implies a more efficient representation of the relationships between the parts, but not necessarily the parts themselves. And the most important argument is that there is an experimental manipulation that is really strong in the context of this study, and that is to invert the display, which basically lets all the local features be exactly the same, but the gestalt less good. So you can manipulate the goodness of the whole interpretation without affecting the representation of the local elements. So we came up with what we call a confetti walker. So we replace the traditional point lights with colored dots, and we have these confetti displays walk on a treadmill like this. Sorry, it's a bit slow. PowerPoint can't really mimic the original speed, but it's basically the traditional treadmill walker from Johansson's point light displays, but now with colored dots. And we also have a version where we put it upside down, as I said. I don't know whether it works for you, but I see the color changes more easy in this one than in the one before, and that's also what we will test. And then you have a scrambled condition where you basically have only the color changes and no motion, like this. Yeah. So we can basically replicate the original study with very much the same methods, 70 colored dots, and we have upright, inverted, and phase scrambled displays. And again, the task is an adjustment task, so to adjust the rate of change in the test figure until it matches the rate of change in the comparison figure. And we do a direct comparison of dynamic and static versions. So always the comparison figure is scrambled, and the test figures are either upright or inverted. And these are the results. So again, it's what you could call motion silencing, and it's the adjustment that people apply. You have the main effect of motion, which is basically a replication of the Sushov and Alvarez study. So silencing is much higher in the dynamic case than in the static case. You could call it motion silencing. But in addition, we have this other main effect between upright and inverted, which has to do with the quality of the gestalt of the perceived motion walker, basically. So both for the dynamic and the static version, the upright gives much larger suppression of the parts than the inverted, and that is the case both for dynamic and static. So on top of the effect of static versus moving, there is a clear effect of configurality. You could call it the goodness of the gestalt level percept, the level of seeing the whole biological motion. And we could call this the cost of objecthood. So the more strongly the parts are integrated into the perception of a whole object, the less accessible the changing features of the parts are. So there is a cost of objecthood in the sense that if you really have a very good gestalt, you don't care so much anymore about the representation of the features and the local parts. And actually, we knew this already from embedded figures. All of you know the embedded figures test. If you have to find this one over here, you know it's there, but it's hard to see. So you basically have to recompose this into the local elements and then find the local elements here. I can point it out to you. It's here, you know. And you basically have another one over here. Yeah. It's there, trust me. You can use a marker and you can really see. But this is a really good gestalt. So you do not have those features available anymore for reassembling this part, and that causes the embedding, which is another way of saying a cost of objecthood. So this is one example of eliminative gestalts. There is a second one with a bistable diamond. This is basically work from Scott Murray's lab, papers from a couple of years ago. I cannot assume that everyone has seen it, so I'll try to demonstrate it. But I've tried it before, and the contrast is really not that good. So what you should see here behind these blue bars are these black elements. You see them? If I put them in motion, you see a diamond moving from left to right. I hope you can see it from where you are. If I put this in motion, which has the same local elements, you probably see the elements going up and down. Now, one way you can see this one as also a diamond going left-right is to fixate in the middle when I put both of them in motion, and then you get some entrainment. At least for me it works. You can really see these elements also as a diamond going left and right behind a virtual occluder. If it doesn't work in this context, go on the web and try some variations. There's variations that really work. But the bottom line is, with this ambiguous display, a lot of people see local motions up and down, that is element level interpretations in terms of vertical motion, and then you also have some people, after a while, who see this as a diamond that moves from left to right. At the global level, you have the diamond. At the local level, you have the elements. The elements move up and down. The diamond moves left to right. So clearly distinct two possible interpretations of the same display. I'm sorry that the demo didn't work so well here. So this has really nice features. You have perceptual bistability, the part seen to move vertically, the whole seen to move horizontally. And the nice thing about this version of bistable percepts is that the switching is relatively slow and the perceptual states are really clear. If you experience it, you know you experience it. There's no hesitation. I see these local features going up and down, or I see the global diamond going left-right. It's a really clearly distinct percept. And you have stable individual differences. You can actually measure it in individual observers and play with the length of the elements to equate the two percepts, which is really nice for the paradigm I'm going to present. So it's been studied extensively at psychophysical level. Now, the nice thing that Murray et al. Did was to look at the brain activity in the context of these two possible percepts. So they presented bistable diamonds and asked observers to indicate whether they perceived the parts, that is the line segments going up and down, or whether they perceived the whole, that is the diamond going left, right. And at the same time, they record both activity in different areas of the brain, and they relate these activities to the percepts that people reported. And these are the results. So this is both activity over time. Here in V1, which is a local area, as I said before, when you are switching from a non-diamond state to a diamond state, you see activity going down. So activity is high when you are in the non-diamond state, that is the local percept, and activity is low if you are in the diamond state, when you see the diamond. And the other way around, when you switch from diamond, activity is low, to non-diamond, activity becomes high. So clearly V1 codes the motion of the local elements. In LOC, which is the object area that I mentioned before, you see exactly the opposite pattern. So when you switch from diamond to non-diamond, you see that activity goes from high levels to really low levels, and the other way around, from non-diamond it's very low and it switches to high when you switch to diamond. So they are completely complementary patterns of activities. And you actually see the switching taking place across the different areas on the visual stream at these different levels of hierarchy. So this is a really nice example of local areas doing local motion and a global area for object level doing global diamond motion. So the discussion here, I think this is a convincing demonstration of inverse activity patterns in V1 and LOC. The question is, what does it mean? The explanation that Murray et al. Give is that the perception of the parts is suppressed by the perception of the whole. So when you are in the state of seeing the diamond, you do not represent the parts anymore in V1. Another way of saying this is in the context of predictive coding. I don't know how many of you are aware of that, but it's a really nice new general theory of what the brain is supposed to do. It is basically the idea that we continuously generate predictions, and the feed-forward sweep is not the incoming information, but the deviation from the prediction. So when you are in a good Gestalt percept, you basically have nothing left to explain at the low level. Everything fits, and therefore you have very little activity at V1. So this is basically, in the context of a good Gestalt, explaining away the features and therefore the suppression of V1. Now we try to test this idea with the same paradigm but a different measurement technique. And basically what we showed is that the reduction of activity in V1 is completely global. So everything in V1 is silent, not just the retinotopically corresponding parts that match the features. So we're not so sure whether explaining away is really the best interpretation here. So the general conclusion, wrapping up all these different things I've said about different types of gestalts and these different phenomena. So the encoding of parts, wholes, and their relationships constitutes a serious challenge to the visual system. I really think that's the reason why there is no simple story. There are different functional relationships between parts and wholes, and we need to have a whole range of flexible mechanisms to encode all these. So the visual system appears to have developed flexible mechanisms to deal with this complexity, and they have different characteristics. So sometimes the wholes are encoded in low-level areas, maybe based on feedback. These are the examples that I mentioned in the beginning from Zoe Kurzi, contour integration, and also the Scott Murray lab on size constancy and density of V1 neurons. Secondly, sometimes wholes are encoded in high-level areas, these high-level gestalts as I call them, while the parts are preserved in low-level areas. I've called these preservative gestalts. And then sometimes wholes are encoded in high-level areas while the parts are suppressed in low-level areas, and I've called these eliminative gestalts. So the bottom line is, as I anticipated, not all gestalts are equal. There's different types of gestalts. I distinguish at least 3. Probably there's more if you start thinking about it more deeply. But further research is needed to establish the specific properties of these different cases, that is the computational reasons why we have these mechanisms, also the boundary conditions, when do they happen, depending on the task and the stimulus, etc., etc. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but I think distinguishing these different types of gestalts at least avoids the simple story that you always have the same types of gestalts, and therefore it must either be global precedence or it must be incremental buildup of percepts. I don't think that's the case. There's different types of gestalts, and therefore we should look at the distinctions between these different types of gestalts at the level of phenomenological experience as well as at the level of the neural mechanisms. Thank you very much.